love to, start with just maybe an introduction to yourself, Oyster, and kind of what you've been up to over the past year and a half.
Great. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here. So I'm Shannon Lincoln. I'm the CFO of Oyster, currently in San Francisco, originally from Toronto. And Oyster has been on a pretty incredible growth journey over the past 18 months or so. We're a global employment platform, so we are on a mission to create a more equal world by letting companies everywhere hire people anywhere. And we went from a seed stage company about 18 months ago to a Series C company in April this year. So it's been a wild ride.
Yeah, I'm sure I think, going through that kind of growth, I'm sure there's a lot of challenges and opportunities, I'm sure, that have been unlocked as part of that growth journey. And that's something I definitely love to dig into. But before we start going into your journey with Oyster, I'd love to understand how you ended up in this high growth tech space, because obviously I think you started out your life in Canada and then moved into consulting originally. But maybe talk us through kind of what drew you from the professional services space into working in these kind of high growth environments.
Yeah, good question. So I was actually in audit at PwC, so a little less less exciting than the consulting side. But I wanted to switch to the other side and really be part of building something, as opposed to sort of coming in every year and checking and pointing out, what had gone wrong and trying to fix that. So moved to the Bay Area about 7 years ago, and I joined a startup right after their Series A. And I would say I got addicted to company building and seeing the impact that the financial experience that I had could have on an early stage company with a very fast feedback loop, and especially working with others who didn't necessarily have that financial perspective. I found it pretty exciting to see, the changes that we could make so quickly, and the impact that could have on growth.
Yeah, nice. What were there any, I guess, major lessons or takeaways from your journey at PwC? Because you spent a fair bit of time there, I think 6 years. So any of those, I guess, lessons outside of obviously the technical skills, I'm sure you would have picked up that you would have been deploying in your roles post.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, at the end of the day, I think it's always about the people. That was true as far as me joining PwC as opposed to other firms, and also as far as the clients. We always had the best results when we had a team that was really sort of on the same page, and the communication was flowing. So I would say that's always the first step that I look to, is the people. And from there, I think you can achieve a lot. You can resolve differences of opinion. You can get everyone marching in the same direction around a common goal. And then, like you said, the technical is a prerequisite as well, and not to be ignored. But I think the relationships that you build with the people you're working with are probably the most important thing, and that's the hardest part to get right as well.
I wanted to share a little recommendation that I found on your LinkedIn. I'm not sure, this is from 2015, but it's definitely one of the most glowing recommendations I've ever seen in my life. And so I wanted to quote a little bit and really try and understand what makes you tick, and what really, I guess, whether there were experiences that were foundational to, I guess, your approach and style in your professional life. But I guess the quote, and I recommend everyone, we'll obviously link to your LinkedIn profile in our show notes, but I recommend everyone have a read. But some of the quotes from that recommendation. So Shannon asks all the right questions. She gets information from you in a manner that you realize you know a lot more than you think. She makes you feel confident after every conversation. She taught me the value of asking the right questions. She talks so little, she listens a lot. And when she talks, it is so well paid for the time that you waited. And she dares to make great decisions and makes them with 100% confidence. That's obviously like a wonderful recommendation from a former colleague, and it's one that I hope I can get as well on my LinkedIn. But help me understand where that style and approach has come from.
Yeah, I would say you're definitely cherry picking there, but that was actually from a client as opposed to a colleague who I worked really closely with and helped through some tough challenges. We had a pretty close relationship. So I guess I would say, yeah, I don't know if it's a Canadian thing. I usually default to listening and figuring out, what other people know before sharing what I know. And I think I think that's important. I think it lets me come into conversations with confidence because I've heard, the other side of it first. And I think you figure things out much faster that way, as opposed to, coming in assuming you're the smartest person in the room. I think it's always better to assume that you're the dumbest person in the room, and then add the pieces that you can add. I think if everyone took that approach, um, you would end up better off. You might be a little slower to start, but I think everyone's got a little piece of something to add, and they should be able to add it. And
How do you think about that approach in a leadership context? Because I'm sure the Oyster team would be looking at you as the CFO, senior executive, expecting you to come into discussions with strong views and strong opinions. So how do you balance that now that you're in quite a senior leadership role?
yeah, I think that's a great point. I think one, you have to hire people that you trust. I heard. I think it was Patrick Collison say something in an interview that when you hire someone, you want to be sure that if you know if someone's wrong, you're just as likely to think that it's you who's wrong as the person that you're talking to. So I think the first step is hiring the right people where you can really trust that they're going to do things in the right way. And then I think as I become more senior, I think I learned that it's more about setting the high level direction and then letting the team really bring the experiences from the field and being able to run with it. And I think letting them sort of lead gets you to a better answer in the end, even if it's not the exact way that you would do it. I think the ownership that the team takes is going to balance out, any differences in the way that you would have approached a situation if you did it personally.
I've read online that hiring executives into a startup is quite challenging, and often, I think I read a stat somewhere where 50% of executive hires kind of leave the business sort of within 12 months, and so the hit rate seems to be not fantastic. Obviously, you and Tony have found a really positive working relationship, and you're going from strength to strength. What did you do? What did you do? What did Tony do? What did the broader Oyster team do to ensure that, one, there was alignment in, I guess, your styles, values, and then two, that you were best positioned to be successful within the organization over a longer period of time as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Tony realized the importance of hiring a strong leadership team from the very beginning, and he actually partnered with an executive search recruiter from before they were a seed stage company, and so we apply a fairly rigorous process to every exec hire that we make. There's a case study in particular that all candidates need to do, and they prepare a deck and send a pre-read, because a lot of the work that we do is asynchronous. So it's a test of those skills, and then also a live presentation for about half an hour, followed by a Q&A period. And I think that's the biggest thing that I would point to as far as getting that upfront alignment and making sure that people are on the same page at the same time as testing the skills required for the job. As far as once people are hired, I think Tony applies what he calls a servant leadership style, which is all about empowering your team to really do their best, and he encourages us to push work down, and he pushes work down to us, and he comes to conversations asking how he can help, as opposed to handing out instructions. He sets the high level strategic direction, and then he really allows us to sort of take those balls and run with them. So that's the way I love to work, and I think it's been a very successful strategy.
I really like the concept of the case study that mimics, I guess, your real work environment with the asynchronous practices. Interested to dive into that a little bit more. You've obviously, you're a remote first company. You've got 500 employees all around the world. How do you guys manage having people in different time zones? Do you still come together? How much of the work is actually fully asynchronous? How do you, I guess, balance building that culture, in that remote first way?
Yeah, great question. So we've got over 600 employees in about 70 different countries, and we default to asynchronous work wherever possible. So what that means is we use long form written communication wherever we can, and that information is public by default, so it can be consumed asynchronously by a lot of people at once. If something is better shared verbally, then we will record Loom videos explaining things, and allow people to consume that asynchronously and watch it on 2x or pause it if it's no longer relevant to them. And then if we do get together for a discussion, it's just that we're not repeating any of the information sharing that has already taken place. It's really about debating and discussing the issues. And so I think you're able to move a lot faster that way because you can do things in parallel. You're not constrained by people's overlapping synchronous availability. And the other thing that it does is it really democratizes decision making quite a bit, because you can share that information with a lot more people and get input from a lot more people really, really well.
How do new hires get onboarded to adapt to this way of working? Because the style it still feels very new, right? It's still, I think, something people are unfamiliar with.
Yeah, so consistent with our asynchronous approach, we have a very extensive onboarding program that's a series of Notion pages and Loom videos that talk about all of these things that seem trivial but are really important. Things like putting your working hours in Slack, or best ways to use Slack, best ways to set up your calendar and organize things. And the tools are important, but it's really about getting that alignment about the way that you work that I think is more important. But I've been very pleasantly surprised by the rate at which people can onboard, because all of this is written, as opposed to relying on people to verbally share how the company works and how we like to work.
You're still a very young company, so I'm impressed by the discipline in your documentation and the rigor that you've got, even in the onboarding process. Because I know I joined Airwallex, we were 200 people, and I don't think we had anything written down at that point. It was a lot of information in a lot of people's heads. And even today, we're still building that muscle and that habit. So was that something that you guys have been doing from the start? How has that evolved over time?
Yeah, so it is actually something that Tony invested in very early on. Before he hired me, actually, he hired remote work consultants who then became part of the company, actually. And he believes that we are building the product. Essentially, we're encouraging people to become distributed, global companies, and therefore it's our job to lead the way and model, how to be the best distributed company in the world. And so he invested in a team, our remote work team, who essentially would audit our practices and really invest in all this documentation to make sure that we were growing really efficiently. And I think without that infrastructure, it is hard to grow as fast as we did. It's hard to grow as fast as we did even with that infrastructure, but the infrastructure definitely enabled that rate of growth.
I'd love to dive into some of those challenges. So your headcount has gone from, I think, double digits, sort of 17, 18 to, I think you mentioned 600 plus now in probably less than 2 years. That's obviously a lot of new talent. The culture would have shifted and changed a lot over time. And I'd love to dig into the culture piece shortly. But I'm interested in what some of those challenges were as you guys were onboarding, recruiting, and growing this rapidly.
I think the pace itself is a challenge because, like I said, asynchronous work allows things to move more quickly, and at times people can feel overwhelmed by the amount of information that is thrown at them. And I think also, even though everyone was worried that remote work would cause people to work less, what they found was that it actually caused people to work more. And so I think burnout is a real risk with this environment because there's a tendency for some people to think that they always need to be on, since somebody at the company is always on, literally, just because of time zones. So I think we set a good tone at the top there. Tony doesn't work on weekends. I don't receive emails on weekends. We do focus Fridays where people can sort of flex the day and take personal appointments if they need to. And we explicitly state that the expectation is that you set your own hours and you work within those. So I think that's how we combated that, but it's something that we need to continue to work on and make sure that new joiners understand.
It makes sense. It feels like this has been quite a deliberate journey, even though it's been quite fast. It feels like it's been planned. You've made a lot of strategic decisions. I mean, even now when you talked about modeling the behavior for the rest of the employees at the leadership level, where does I guess, what are the companies or stories or insights that you are drawing on? What are the best practices that you're leaning on to help you figure out how you want to be building Oyster?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we make a few different analogies when we do fundraising pitches and when we talk to employees. One that Tony likes to think about is Tesla, and that they open sourced a lot of their technology to allow others to benefit from that. And he's a big fan of that, to allow other people to become great distributed companies, because as he says, this is a movement, this is a new category that we're building, and we need others to sort of adopt this way of thinking as much as we need them to buy into Oyster specifically. And so Tesla is one that comes to mind. There's other, like Salesforce, for example. It's selling, sales software, obviously, and arguably, they've invested in having the best sales team in the world. They're modeling, the behavior that they're selling, and it's all part of the product, essentially.
I'd love to chat a little bit about diversity. Oyster is, I think, quite a diverse company already. I think it's something that all companies are striving for, because the understanding now, I think, exists in market that diverse organizations across multiple dimensions tend to outperform and have advantages. And so, but achieving that is difficult. I think that's not something you can default fall into if you don't think about it explicitly. So how have you been thinking about that and designing your organization in a way that promotes and builds a diverse workforce?
Yeah, so this is something that I think is very important. You pointed to one data point about why it's important to have diverse teams, because they perform better. But I think there's lots of reasons. I think it's the representation by population argument, essentially, right? That is often applied in the context of government, but essentially, if you have a small group of people in leadership, for example, making decisions on behalf of a bigger group, you want to make sure that they represent the group that they're making decisions on behalf of. And, so we have 50% of women in leadership. The world is made up of 50% women, for example. Therefore, there should be 50% of women in leadership, if you follow that logic. And what Oyster does is basically take that argument 3 steps further by saying, you shouldn't just look at it from a gender perspective. You should look at it on every relevant dimension of diversity, and essentially our company should look like the world. And the way that we enable that is by global hiring. So it becomes much, much easier when you're tapping into a global talent pool and hiring people from all over the world to hit these diversity goals. And there is an element of intentionality where Tony is, encouraging the leadership team to hire diverse teams, and we are encouraging our managers to hire diverse teams. But a lot of it is the fact that we hire globally and that we're enabled to do that. And if you believe that the talent is just as good, if not better, outside of Bay Area or wherever it is, then the rest is really just going to happen naturally.
Can you talk me through some tactics that you use as part of whether it's your recruitment process, your sourcing process for talent, that allows you to make sure that this is front of mind for your managers?
When we post jobs, and there are practical limitations to doing this as well, right? Remote work is a newer concept, and so a lot of job boards like even LinkedIn and Indeed, who are investors in Oyster, they don't typically let you just post a job that's labeled remote. You have to pick a location because they need to know where to advertise that job to, right? And so that's something that they're actively working on. But in the meantime, we will post 4 versions of the same job rec to 4 major cities to try and cover all the time zones and show that we are hiring anywhere. Even with that, you will tend to get more applications in those cities because people assume you want someone in that specific city. But I think, we've got a lot of branding showing that we will hire people anywhere, and these roles are truly meant to be global remote roles. So that's one piece. And then I think we monitor it. It's nothing formal, but we do track the stats, and we check in on that, and we will naturally try to improve them, but we also will share nudges if we're getting off track in certain areas. And Tony especially, he's really passionate about hiring in emerging markets, so he pushes that from the top.
I think that's really helpful, especially I think that the point you made around even the recruitment platforms today or the job ad platforms aren't actually set up to support this new world that we're starting to operate in. Something to be mindful of. I'm interested in your personal journey into leadership. What are some of the difficult issues you've faced as a woman in the workforce transitioning into a senior leadership role?
I would say 2 things come to mind. I mean, one is I think naturally, in lean in and a lot of, documentation about women in the workplace, people say you can't be what you can't see, and often there are fewer, women in positions of power. And so I think it's important to have mentors. I had some very influential mentors early on who really sort of looked out for me and helped kind of pull me up along with them. And I think that's important. And then I think it's also about advocating for yourself and making sure you're doing that. There are stats about how men will apply to a job if they have less than 50% of the qualifications. Women will apply when they have close to 100. I'm sure I'm getting those numbers wrong, but I think it's there is an element of confidence and just making sure that you're being your best advocate as well, independent of whether you have those mentors and people who can help you.
What advice would you give to other women around the world who are facing challenges rising into these roles?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important to pick the right organizations in the first place and make sure that people are going to be supportive of you based on your merit, independent of your gender. And like I said, I think it's important to advocate for yourself and make sure that you're you're positioning yourself in the best light possible, and not to think of it as arrogance or self promotion even, but to think of it as what's needed in order to get attention and to be recognized appropriately.
I'd love to switch gears a little bit into talking about your role as a CFO in a fast-growing startup in the midst of what it feels like a market meltdown. I'm sure you're going through some interesting challenges. You've been part of, I think, a number of fundraisers in your role at Oyster. So interested to understand what's been. I think let's talk a little bit firstly about the role that you've played as part of those fundraisers. What's the right partnership between a founder and a CFO going through those fundraisers? And then we can talk a little bit about, I guess, the market today and how you're thinking about navigating the business through the next couple of years.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in fundraising, it needs to be founder-led as far as, the pitch and oftentimes the relationships as well. I think, especially at the earlier stages, VCs are very much looking to build those relationships, and they want to see the founder, understanding the numbers as well as the high-level story. So I think that's the first step, but the role of the financial support person is not to be diminished either. And I think that the more that the financial role takes or shares in coming up with the narrative and the pitch, the better the outcome will be, because you need those two. You need the story to align with the numbers at the end of the day, and the financial person is going to understand the numbers inside out. And so that would be my big recommendation, is that it does need to be a true partnership. It can't be, disjointed pieces of the same process. They need to work together.
How do you think about the projections that you're putting in these decks? Now, I'm not going to ask, obviously, what the Oyster numbers are and forecasts, but one thing I've observed, even seeing startup pitch decks, is often the goals are very ambitious. The numbers are ambitious as well. You're coming from an audit background where you've had training in modeling and financial projections, and operating now in a high uncertainty environment. How do you think about your role in balancing, I guess, what's realistic, what's ambitious, and really tapering whether it's founder or investor expectations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say you need to be ambitious with your fundraising projections. It's very common to have two versions of the numbers. The one that you show to the board, which I typically try to underpromise and overdeliver on, and then the fundraising forecast, which, to be frank, you should not be outperforming, or else you're likely discounting the value of your company, because the VCs are going to discount it for you. So you want to make sure that you're presenting projections that are as ambitious as any other projections that they're going to see. And at the end of the day, VCs aren't stupid either. They're not taking a blanket haircut across all forecasts. They're going to look at your actuals and your trends, and they're going to, know to a degree how ambitious your forecast is. So I would say you have to be careful about where you inflate things to the extent that you are, and there's ways to do that are going to be more successful than others. But at the end of the day, I think it's about understanding your business, and I think the VCs are looking to you for that. They know that you understand it better than anyone else, and as long as you can sort of explain it to them and it makes sense, and you build up credibility throughout the process when you talk about your numbers and when you show historical numbers. I think you'll get a smaller discount on your projections. So that's also a balance.
How do you help other folks in the leadership teams get close and stay close to the numbers, whether it's the founders or, marketing, product? I feel like your role, while it's focused on a particular function, helps build confidence and trust in other functions. And you definitely want founders who understand the numbers, product leaders who understand how what they're building impacts the numbers. So how do you advocate and build that shared level of understanding about where the business is at and where it's going?
And something that we've been doing even more, in the current environment. I think there's more appetite for it from employees and other departments, and something that we're very happy to provide and have been providing more insight into. So I would say the first thing is to involve the other departments in coming up with those projections in the first place, and working very closely with them on that. That's the best way to get a forecast that you're going to hit, and also to get alignment across the business and make sure everyone's moving in sync. And then I think the data is another big piece of that, right? And I think as much as possible, you want to have a single source of truth. And there are various ways that you can do that. We have a very strong data team who has set up a very robust instance of Looker that everyone looks to as the single source of truth, and they can self-service their data needs from there. So I think people are hungry for the information, and as long as you can provide it to them in a scalable way, then that goes a long way in terms of keeping everyone on the same page.
Let's talk about the market downturn. So how has your role now shifted in the last 3 to 6 months as the economy has started to take a turn?
Yeah. So I think, like everyone, we took a step back and reran our numbers and made sure that we were being realistic, and that we, have enough capital to survive what are very likely to be choppy fundraising waters the next time we go out. So I think that those are the basics. I think the next part is you have to be very closely monitoring your results against that plan. You can't create a plan and then stick it in a drawer. You need to realize that things are changing very quickly. And so, the most agile companies are going to be the ones who survive this. So we, again, back to, our real-time data and dashboards, we've added a few more of those that are getting more attention now. And also, I think my role has changed in that like you said, I'm working on providing more visibility into the numbers to employees and to the company. So we've been very transparent with our employee base about where we're at financially. Lucky that we're in a great spot because we fundraised in April, before all this happened. So we couldn't have been luckier in terms of that timing, and that makes it a little easier. But it's helpful to provide that comfort and share that information with employees so that they can be comfortable that the business is financially sound as well.
Your role would shift, I assume, in a way that often, I guess, if departments like marketing are coming to finance and saying, "Hey, I want to go to this event, or I want to sponsor this, this, you know, a sports team, or whatever it is that they're looking to do." I'm not a marketing expert, so I can't probably not coming up with the right examples and doing my marketing colleagues the right credit. But is your team now saying no to budget requests, headcount increases? I often feel like the finance team is the one that often gets left with that difficult job of I guess adjusting people's expectations around what's okay now in this environment versus what's not. Is that something you guys are going through? And if so, how are you ensuring you maintain the right relationship between your team and the other teams?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as much as possible, we did the upfront work to get the high level alignment about what's happening through a series of presentations that I did to our executive team and to the company to align on the big picture. And then I think once everyone's on the same page about that, they understand, when you make changes to the amount that people are expected to spend or the amount that we're expected to hire over the next little bit. And I would say, even once we set those budgets, and yes, we are enforcing them a lot more closely than we were, but we're still trying to give people as much flexibility as possible within that. So, if they have a new need, we encourage them to tell us what they can trade off to support that, as opposed to just saying a blanket no, because at the end of the day, we don't necessarily care what it's being spent on, and we trust that they are the best people to make those decisions. We're just trying to give them the high level objectives and help them to stay within those guidelines.
And then when it comes to investors now, are you chatting to them more regularly? Has the cadence changed, and the, I guess, questions that they're asking of you and your team, has that shifted as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're talking to our board more frequently, for sure. They were, part of the exercise that we did to make sure that everyone's on the same page and aligned. I think that, again, the most important thing there is that you get good investors in the first place who are going to be supportive of you. When you're doing well and when you're doing poorly. Not that we're in that position now, but who knows where everyone's going to be in 2 years. And I think the first step is getting good investors who can support you. And then the second step is exactly like you say, keeping them in the loop, and making sure that you're minimizing surprises as much as possible. So that's another thing that we do that ties into the asynchronous work. So our board meetings are mostly asynchronous, where we share all of the materials and Loom videos in advance, and our board meetings are much more about hearing the board's feedback, as opposed to these 3-hour marathon sessions where we're talking at them, and they may be looking at their phone or listening. It depends on who it is and what they have going on that day. So our board loves that approach, and they're very receptive to that. And so we've got a very good relationship built on discussion and two-way feedback.
It's amazing that it actually extends all the way to the board meeting. I think I didn't realize how seriously you guys are taking the asynchronous approach. I'm interested to maybe dive a little bit more into Oyster, your platform, and the reluctance that companies today may have, or founders may have, in using platforms like yourself to build a distributed team. So, what are some of the challenges that you think founders today are running into when they think about, well, maybe might not be the right next step for me or my organization, because they're nervous for whatever reason?
Yeah, I think the biggest constraint there is about the time zones, and I don't blame people for not understanding how this could work. If you haven't seen it before, it's hard, and so I think that's part of it. I think some people, depending on their leadership style, might not believe that employees' work can be monitored as closely. We're very much about monitoring output instead of input, and that's enabled by a remote work environment. I would say the people who come to us, they're generally already excited about global hiring. People often come to us with a hire in mind, and then the constraints are more about just figuring out all the logistics. How does parental leave work in Spain? How hard is it to terminate someone in France? It's a little different than at-will employment in the U.S. And those are more of the questions that we get, and that's exactly what Oyster is designed to help with, is to figure out all that stuff for our customers and make that really easy to navigate, and we navigate as much on their behalf as possible, and then let them give them the information that they need to make the decisions that they need to make in the context of global employment.
It feels like Oyster's also riding, I guess, a broader macro trend, right, with this distributed workforce as well. And there are other companies like Oyster that are spinning up, growing and scaling, just as quickly. What's the are there nerves internally with, I guess, the competition as more and more startups realize this is actually a space that is one both um, aligned from a macro trend perspective, but also potentially highly profitable as well?
Yeah, there are a lot of players that have come into the space who have recognized, the market potential and the paradigm shift that is enabling us to grow so quickly. I would say it's a very complicated product that we're building, and so it's not something that you can just spin up with a few engineers, over the course of a few months. Um, and it's something that I think is helped by the fact that Tony's a second time founder. It's a very complex business in a lot of ways, and his experience and the experience of everybody that he's hired definitely goes a long way in helping us, be set up to build this global employment infrastructure in a compliant way. So there are going to be many or I shouldn't say many. There will be multiple multi-billion-dollar companies in this space, but I think there's also some barriers that will be created by the sheer complexity of what we're doing.
How do you think about the legacy players in this space? Like, what's the attitude to folks? Because there have been, payroll companies, that do global payroll. Obviously, probably not with the technology first approach that you've taken. But what's their kind of reception been? Are you seeing them start to pivot and try and push towards where the space that you're playing in now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, like with anything, legacy players are a little less automated, a little more manual, and take more of a professional services approach to global employment. And the price points are a little higher because things are done manually. There's generally more errors. I'm speaking very broadly about legacy players here, not meaning to target any specific competitor, but generally they're seeing price pressure because we've come in, we've automated things, we're offering it at a lower price point, and we're offering it, in a much more self-service way, which is preferred by a lot of our customers. So, I think we're definitely seeing responses to that in terms of the competitors and their pricing. And I think also the way that they acquire customers has traditionally been through a lot of partnerships. And I think it's going to be tough for those to continue to scale in that way. And I think we're disrupting that as well in terms of the way that we acquire companies. A lot of our acquisition is non-paid and through our branding and our content. So I think we're building a new category essentially, even though there are legacy players in this space.
Makes sense. I'd love to start to wrap up our conversation, but before I do, I want to ask you a little bit about how you personally manage, the role and responsibilities that you have. You're navigating a 600 plus person organization through some pretty unprecedented times. What keeps you going? How do you make sure that you're not letting, I guess, the doom and gloom in the macro environment get to you, and making sure that you're able to bring your best self to work every day?
Yeah, that's a great question. I could take that a few different ways. I think, going back to the people, I've got a great support network at home. I've got a 2.5-year-old son, and I'm actually pregnant right now with my second, and he's an equal partner, which I think is, very important for any working parent, that they've got that support at home. Remote work is also, an enabler of that, because you can disconnect and take time to exercise when you need to, whether it's the middle of the day or, or at the end of your work week. So that's another big thing. But I won't pretend that it's not stressful at the same time. And I think one thing that Tony does very well, and that the employee base at Oyster really appreciates, is he's very open about his feelings, whether they're excitement or anxiety, and he shares that. And I think that gives other people permission to be open at work and talk it out, and that in itself I think can help improve any of the negative feelings that might be coming up. So we've got a very supportive work culture, and I think that's also huge. We encourage people to bring their whole selves to work, as people say, and so that's another big part of it.
Amazing. Congratulations, by the way. Very excited for that next chapter for you. What advice would you give yourself if you go back and talk to yourself at the start of your career? So before you joined PwC, what's one piece of advice you'd give yourself?
That's a great question. I guess I would say don't shy away from the scary opportunities. They're often going to be the places where you grow the most, and there's going to be ups and downs, but I'd rather go through those ups and downs than be at a company that's steady state for years and emerge on the other side not having developed very much or learned very much. So it's not all sunshine and roses, but on the whole, I'd do it again, in a heartbeat, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
That's amazing. How can our listeners be helpful to you and your mission?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think if you're at all interested in global hiring, we can definitely put you in touch with our sales team to help you learn more. I do think that as people are looking to be more efficient with their hiring, in this environment, global hiring is not something that we do because it's cheaper, but the reality is that very few countries pay the same as the Bay Area in terms of salaries, and so if you're looking to manage your bottom line at the same time as grow your company, then global hiring is a great way to do that, and we're very happy to help with that.
And are there any pieces of content, books, or even other podcasts that you think will help founders who are thinking about global hiring for the first time to really get an overview of what their company or business could look like in the future?
Yeah, I'm sure other people in the company can answer that question better than I can, but we have put out quite a bit of content on that. Tony does a lot of podcasts where he talks about this. There's also a few very influential studies in terms of the macroeconomic impact. So, like Brian Kaplan argues that you can triple the world's GDP if you remove the concept of borders from talent mobility. And there's also a study by Korn Ferry that talks about the talent shortages in the Western world and the labor surpluses in the Eastern world, and how you can create a much more efficient global labor market if you allow those two to meet. And I think they estimate that it's about $8 trillion of economic loss every year because of these local talent markets. So if you're looking for the macro justification, I would look there. And then we have a lot of content about how to make global and asynchronous work.